Perfect. A quick note, good morning and or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the eResearch Network session number 4. I'm going to talk a bit more about metadata today, which is, I shouldn't be as excited as I am about metadata, but that's just how it is. I wanted to thank, if you noticed, Rita Van Dynen is helping us today. She is our host. I want to thank her for stepping in as Oliver Bendorf, who was our wonderful host and clear representative, has taken on a new position. We wish him the best because he was great. But Rita is just stepping in. We'll have a new staff member probably for the next session. But just want to give a heads up and a thank you to Oliver. Today, we're going to welcome Dom Fripp, who is the Senior Curation Metadata Developer for JISC. Dom's worked on a number of research discovery projects, including the UK Research Data Discovery Initiative. His research presentation today touches on the core metadata needed for discovery and reuse of research data. He is presenting from home with family and children present and near the cocktail hour. So let's admire his bravery and welcome him from across the Atlantic to the eResearch Network. Welcome, Dom.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to everyone for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about these things. I know that sounds a bit weird. You don't always bump into people and say, can we talk about metadata? But, you know, some of us like it. Jason clearly likes it. I love doing that as well. Before we start on the main part of what I want to say, I just want to introduce a little bit more about myself and the ways of contacting me if you want to. So I was a library grad student not that long ago. I studied at University of West of England in the UK, and I got into research data management in 2013 when it became a thing in this country. And by a thing, I mean the funders started demanding it. So that's when universities got interested, of course. So that's when I started on this project. I was working at the University of Bristol at the time. I started with JISC this January, and my two main projects whilst I'm there, working on the UK Research Data Discovery Service, of which more later, and the Research Data Shared Service, which I will mention in passing, but is a project that's currently in developmental stage, and I will share some links regarding that later on. If you do want to talk to me, I'm active on Twitter, well, not so much recently, but I've been using it for quite a long time now. So it's @Domicus, feel free to use it. If you want to know more about the kind of work I'm doing and what my colleagues are doing, follow the hashtag JISCRDM. That's where we tend to post new blogs, interesting pieces related to the work we're doing. And if you really want to ask me a question, if you're feeling brave, you've got a metadata revelation that you want to share, you know, and you don't want to share it with anyone else but me, just drop me an email. That's quite all right at dom.fripp@jisc.ac.uk. Okay, enough about me. Let's move on to what we're going to talk about today. So really, you know, this is a kind of a big deal. This is what I think is, well, number one, it's the work that I do, but you know, this is an issue. It's not just a kind of a library school discussion. It's not a philosophical discussion. This is a really important thing. Excuse me. And people talk about it all over the world. I've been talking to people all over the world about it, and now I'm talking to you guys. You know, it's not an academic exercise. This is a real problem. It gets talked about in conferences around the world. So, you know, I'm going to keep it lighthearted, but also there are serious points at work here, and I really want to lay out a kind of state of the art, as it were. So I want to talk about first why it matters, because you might not think it does. Plenty of people I've ever spoken to don't think it does, and so they need to be convinced. So I'll try and outline some of that. After that, I want to talk about the FAIR principles with the help of a familiar fictional character I hope you recognize. The FAIR principles are not the main thing we're going to talk about, but they're an important contextual element to what we're going to talk about. So it would be nice to cover those. I know Jason posted a link for those in your kind of preparation materials. It doesn't matter if you haven't had a chance to look at them. Don't worry, we're not going into detail, but we will cover them here as well. Then I'll talk about my main work in the UK Research Data Discovery Service, what I've been doing for the last 8 months, coming up with a core metadata profile, how I did it, and what it's actually supposed to do now I've created it. Then I want to talk a little bit about how it is interfacing with other projects that I am currently engaged with, and how other people have approached me to talk about how it might inform their work. And then I will try and give a summary, try and capture the main elements of what we've been talking about. So, why does it matter? Well, most people will say it matters because somebody told you to do it. Basically, I came to this whole issue because funders in the UK, and I know it's the same here in the States, they need to see research data being published alongside academic papers. It needs to be available, it needs to be findable, it needs to be described, it has to be related to the paper, it has to support the theses that the paper is advancing. It has to be using a persistent identifier. It has to be identifiable over time. It has to be accessed over time. These are all things that funders are demanding now. They started off softly, and so can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm just looking at the chat, and I don't want to carry on if no one can hear me. Oh, is it all right? Okay, as long as everyone can hear me, Brill. Thank you. I'll carry on. So it's not just a matter of what people want to do or whether it's good practice. These are things that are now being asked for. If you want your research money, if you want to have completed your research satisfactorily, you have to have done these things. And all of these things, the way you describe your research data is to do with metadata. So the other thing that's important to researchers is getting citations. It's good for their kind of research, their professional reputation. They want their data to be reused. It's not just a forum for research papers anymore. The data is a valuable research object in its own right, and therefore it has to be described, and it has to be reusable, and it has to be citable. And all of these things are very important for the individual reputations of the researchers and how their research fits in with any other work that's going on in the world. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, it's kind of it's becoming a big thing with certain funders in the UK. It's called the EPSRC here. They're talking about reproducibility and how important that is in the scientific endeavour. This seems like it's been obvious, but actually no, people haven't really kind of given it much thought for recently, and actually now with data becoming more available, there needs to be transparency. Work needs to be checked. There's plenty of stories out there where there's been negligence or maybe falsified results. Science doesn't want to get involved in that. Science wants to be transparent, and therefore reproducibility is a key factor in that. But how do you reproduce someone's work? I mean, how can you do it virtually? What information do you need to know about that work in order to reproduce it? Now, of course, with reproducibility, that goes up substantially, and there's all sorts of issues about capturing a total metadata environment, i.e., every lab setting, every machine, all of that basically, and there's tools being developed to do that. So it's a big thing. But I don't just want to concentrate on science. This is a broad canvas. Equally, all of this applies to arts and digital humanities materials. So I've listed a few there. Some of those are straightforward. One of the ones I wanted to mention briefly was consent. People forget, if we're talking about a recording of a performance, a theatre performance, number one, how do you describe it? Number two, have you got the consent of everybody to be in that recording? And then how are you going to represent that consent through metadata? This is a big issue. This is about access, and we'll come to that later. But of course, you might have overlooked the fact that some research objects are physical objects. Now, there isn't just a sharing of that. You can't just download that from the internet, and therefore the metadata record for a physical object is its key. It's the key piece for it to be found and used at all. So when you've got a situation like that, metadata is the only thing that can be dealt with until you find the object. So this is why it's important. So I'm going to move on to the FAIR principles now. With the aid of a rather daring-do fictional character. He's basically an archaeologist and adventurer and a scientist and a researcher. He's an intrepid researcher that we're going to use for a series of light-hearted prompts about the FAIR principles. And of course, because this is a fictional character, I'd like to make The fair use, since we're talking about fair, it's important to state the fair use disclaimer here in case I get into trouble by anyone. Okay. So, so you're Indy, you're the researcher. I mean, how do you assess the value or the completeness or the viableness? How do you assess the quality of a data set without clues, without information about it? And the answer is you can't. You need certain information about it. You need to glean that from somewhere, and without that information, the item is useless, or you don't know if you've got the item that you want. And I've put a quote up here from Mark Wilkinson and others that's been published in Nature recently. And why I put this up is because when we get onto the FAIR principles, it's kind of like quite dry, and it's a list of like, it feels like a very prescriptive list. But actually, what he's trying to remind us is that basically data management, the process of doing this, of adding metadata, isn't just some kind of academic kind of annoyance or just kind of high bar or barrier to things. It's not trying to support anyone in their ivory tower. What this is about, what metadata and good metadata is about, is providing a conduit to knowledge, discovery, and innovation. It is the business of research. Okay, it's not just the formality. It's not just librarian stuff. This is what all researchers should be doing, or can be doing, to make their data very valuable. So, and understood by others. That's the other thing. Not it's everyone works in their little bit. Not everybody understands whether they can even use something that you've produced. In order for them to understand it, you have to describe that. So the FAIR principle stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I'm just going to cover these with a series of images from Raiders of the Lost Ark, because I think it kind of nicely sums up the kind of the ideas, but also the kind of traps that are involved in doing all of these things. So the first is findable. So this is a very important factor for funders and research impact. If you can put your research data out there, you can make it available, but if nobody can find it, it's useless. So the FAIR principles, and the FAIR principles, I should say, are guidelines only. These are not mandates. These are not written in stone. These are not, you're not taken off to prison if you don't apply these to your research data when you publish. Thanks for posting the link, Jason. I have got it in the last slide of resources to check out as well. So to be findable, any data object should be uniquely and persistently identifiable. And this data object should be refindable at any point in time. This data object should be persistent with emphasis on their metadata. So basically, you have to come up with a persistent identifier, a permanent link that does not change over as much time as is specified by the funder mandates. In the UK, that can vary between 3 years and perpetuity, which the latest legal reading of perpetuity is 10 years plus 10 years. That's a long time in technical terms. So, this is a serious business. It's not about just kind of solving something and then forgetting about it. This has to be working in 20 years. Realistically, this technology has to be working in 50 years, or 100. We don't know yet, but, the idea is to come up with persistent links. And basically, I should also say that the FAIR principles often talk about the machine readability or the machine functionality of these principles. I'm not really going to concentrate so much on that. I quite like the human angle to it, but for people who are coders or kind of look at it from a kind of machine learning kind of position, you can probably understand some of these other points, basically. So unique and persistent identifiers for discovery, and we're going to come to what we do or how we do that later. Accessible. You want to be able to get into the data, or if you can't, you need to know why not. Can you reuse it? Are there restrictions on how you can use it? Can you use some of it and not others? Do you need to sign up somewhere to do it? Do you need to sign in to get there? All of these things are really important, and the thing that really drives this from a metadata point of view is an understanding of the licensing that applies to the research data itself. Now, this is often done at a file level, which is why it becomes machine readable and machine actionable. But I have to say, personally speaking, I've seen plenty of research data sets without any license information at all, either at file level or object level. And of course, this is a huge problem if you want to go and use this data because you don't know the conditions by which you can use it. People just assume that it's understood because they tend to think of in a very limited way, or the way that their colleagues have used it or their collaborators. But somebody who's never seen your research doesn't understand the protocols that you've applied to it and hasn't got access to the descriptions of all of that. They're not going to have a clue how to actually get into your data or whether they can use it, and this is a problem. Interoperability, okay, that's the kind of tricky word about it. So I'm just looking at Jason. Data object, yeah, I think so. We're going to come to data set, data object issues later on. I think we can conflate them for today, but I will cover a little nuance that everyone should be aware of at the end of the presentation. So interoperability is really about kind of like, do you understand what you're opening, which is exactly, the problem that the Nazis had with the Ark. So, is there any special methods you need? Will this data work within the parameters of what you want it to? Is it described in a vocabulary that you understand? Is there use of controlled vocabularies, and if so, do you know what they are? Is this compatible with other software that you have? Now, all of this is our interoperability challenges. Now, to have a clue about that, whether you're a machine or a human being, that information all needs to be present. And I have to say, it's probably one of the least seen bits of metadata that I can remember in my experiences over the last few years. Sorry, people tend to just assume that you know how to do it. People will release a MATLAB simulation, won't say what version of MATLAB, won't say if you need any special dictionaries, add-ons, plugins, anything like that. It's just assumed that say everybody in the whole world's got exactly the same version of MATLAB. I'm going to put my hand up and say I know that's not true. So yeah, that's a big issue. And then finally, reusable. Really, this is the kind of this is what everybody wants, and here this is what everybody wants. But to even get here, we've got to have gone through the first three principles. You have to even start thinking about reusability. Reusability is principles 1 to 3 and some more on top of it. So as we can see, so reusable. If you have significant disciplinary metadata with your research object, then it should be included. If there are kind of factors, laboratory factors, machine, information that goes with it, software, things like that, anything that is needed to make sense of the data should be included with the data, and therefore data, or kind of research objects become a little bit more than just a data set. They become the instruments needed to open and run or explore the data set also. So that's just a very quick primer in FAIR, and we're kind of going to come back to it shortly, but we're going to leave that now. We're going to thank you very much, Indiana Jones. Now I'm a poor second really, but I'm going to come in and talk about what I've been doing, which isn't quite as exciting as finding the Ark, but each to their own, right? So just to fill you in a little bit about the UK Research Data Discovery Service. What happened was, last year, as part of the way JISC Futures works, is they look around for kind of burgeoning issues, and discovery was one of them because, like I said before, because of the relationship with funding, and cash is king in this regard. People don't want funding to dry up. It's a problem, and therefore what JISC looked for was evidence around the world of other research data discovery portals. And as you can probably see, the links probably aren't clear, but you can see there are a selection from around the world attached to different projects. And this was really to get an overview of kind of what was needed, what was out there, what standards, how had people approached this problem already. So when JISC took it on, these are the people that were involved. I won't dwell on this slide. The one thing I wanted to mention that I think is important and why I included it is to understand that with this particular piece of work, it was important to get a balance between the universities on the left, but on the right are discipline-specific data centers, which you can probably see there. And what this gives is an interesting kind of collision between the way research data is offered up. You've got on the one hand, kind of the mid to long tail of research being offered up by individual researchers who have some data to share on an individual basis at their university of study, excuse me, all the way through to places like the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre or the UK Data Service or NERC, all of which are specialist data centres that have been running for years. They have a particular discipline focus, and therefore the type of metadata that they serve up is completely different from the universities. And this is a challenge, one of the challenges that I've had to address, and we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail shortly. Excuse me. I just needed a sip of water there. So, and how this was done, how we developed this, and well, I won't dwell on this, so don't worry about the content too much. I'll just give you a recap of what it is. The way JISC works means that you have to ask various stakeholders and find out what their requirements are for this kind of particular service, or what they would like something to do. And you can see this from the various stakeholders given in these boxes, and they all came up with different user stories. And from the user stories, JISC tries to figure out what the service should do in order to make sure that all of these stakeholders have their requirements represented. And this leads me on to my kind of sub-package of aims that were given to me through this. So I've listed them here. So number one, as I've just said, meet the user requirements. Number two, just to explain quickly, CCAN is the software that we use for the Research Data Discovery Service. You've probably heard of it. I can't. It does stand for something, and I just can't think off the top of my head what it is. But it's quite a popular one. It's open source. It's lightweight. It's quick as well, so developers like it. It's easy to set up an instance as well, so that's why that was chosen. But of course, there was no point coming up with a metadata schema so heavy that it just grounds CCAN to a halt. So there's always some technical factors that you have to bear in mind. It had to be based on existing schemas, and I mean that in the sense of where we could identify good practice, not that it has to be exactly like DataCite, or it has to be exactly like B2Find or any other, or DCMI. What it meant was, let's look at the schemas or the profiles that have been created to support other portals and see what is good about those, what's working, what isn't. So I went and tried all of these, and then did some kind of reverse engineering and some research into exactly what kind of profile that they had. The other thing was that it was no good just coming up with a set of principles or a formula or a profile, kind of etching it into a stone tablet and saying my work is done, cheerio. It doesn't work like that. It has to be flexible. It needs to adapt with the changes of the service, the changing user needs. It's never going to be perfect first time. You can't get precious about these things. You have to kind of serve it up and be prepared to adapt it. I don't think any metadata schema has ever been still on version 1, which just goes to prove the point. So kind of starting on a more technical level, what we did was these categories, these 7 categories across the top: admin, harvest, browse, search, reporting, usability, policy. So these were kind of classifications or categories that we gave the user requirements. So the user requirements fitted into these broad categories, and it allowed me to kind of shake out a few key fields that would be appropriate to the user requirements that are in these different kind of categories. As you can see, I've put the ones that it found there. It wasn't that many actually. So you probably suspect that some of these would probably end up being core metadata fields, and we'll see shortly. But as I said, I didn't want it to be exclusively based on user needs. We didn't talk to everybody, and another way of looking at whether it suits everybody is to look at work that's been done before, and whether it's been on metadata profiles, such as the ones offered by OpenAIRE and DataCite, which are very popular. DataCite particularly because they, in the UK, mint the DOIs, and therefore, if you want a citation, if you want to publish your data, you need to submit metadata to them. So in the UK, they've really driven the kind of standards for the metadata quality of research data. And we'll come on to the similarities between our schemas in a moment. But there's other stakeholders here. So there's the Australian National Data Service, who run a kind of top-to-bottom repository structure for data, including all cultural heritage. So they have a very complex schema called RIF-CS, or RIF-CS, sorry. So that's RIF-CS. Look it up and then look somewhere else, basically. It's my advice. But it was really important to have a look at all of these and just find out what was good practice and what wasn't, or what, maybe what was important and what wasn't. So that's what I was looking for. What's mandatory in these? What's common? What are the features that they all have? Wasn't that many actually. And when they do have, which features or fields, are mandatory in their schemas? And here's some more here. You can see I've done a little old school Wordle of. Now this is a chart taken from my post about how much metadata is enough, which I'll put a link to on the final slide. So basically, you can see from this. I'm sorry, it's probably not too clear, but you can see that there's actually a lot of wild variation between what's mandatory. And then I went in the blog post. I go into some speculation about what that might be, why that might be. Sorry, it's probably something that you should think about yourselves. It's not obvious. There's no right or wrong answer. I've given a couple of answers on my blog post. It would be interesting to see what you think. I think, mainly just to summarize now, there's something about, how low you want the barrier to be for participation, and that's what's important. But you can see, say, DataCite on the left has got 5 mandatory fields, and at the ANDS repository it's got 26. So, that's quite a variation there. Okay, so I've put a link to the core metadata profile, which you are all welcome to look at. So out of all of this, and I'm sorry this won't be particularly clear because of the amount of information and the size of the font that I have to use in order to pack it all on, but do use the tiny URL link up there because that will take you straight to a copy that you can view at whatever size you want. So as you can see, pink is from user requirements, the blue is for common research metadata fields, the grey are associated fields that I then added because they have a dependency on one of the other fields that we've already added. So as you can see at the top, I hope, you can see a creator field. This is very common, although I'll just touch on later as to why it might be going out of fashion. But you can see that there's 3 associated ones there. And of course, we start then getting into, you can see that there's a creator identifier. So we're starting to get into the business of interoperability, the business of persistent identifiers. It doesn't just mean for the data sets, it means for the people that are involved in creating the data sets as well. On 3.1, or is it? No, it must be 2.1 or something. Title type, you can see just as an example of a controlled vocabulary there. So it's not just free fields. So you have the field name, the obligation, is it mandatory, recommended, or optional? Is the occurrence, which is, how many times, is it a repeatable field, is it a non-repeatable field? The type of content that's permitted in the field, and I've given an example next to it. It's from a fictional data set that I've kind of constructed from a bunch of other things, just so everything's represented, but you can kind of get a flavour for how that's been set up there. So back to FAIR. Um, to just explain briefly as to how this metadata profile is FAIR. For the findable aspects, if you can recall, this profile, it admits persistent identifiers, and with a lot of the optional fields, it encourages it, probably ones that don't really exist yet, so or are in the process of being more widely adopted. So there's also the flexibility angle as well. It's like we want everything to be based on persistent identifiers, because that means huge amounts of information can be linked up in a very simple way for humans and machines to interrogate. That's something that I think is very worthwhile, and that's why it's a core feature of this metadata profile. For accessibility, again, persistent identifiers are accommodated, so if you can get to it, you shouldn't have to go wandering off on a vast path of finding it, going around in circles, having to ask a bunch of different researchers or research desks or angry librarians about how to get access. It should all be there if you can get it. And if it's not, it encourages access information and licensing information to be present in the metadata record as well. I can't remember which field that is off the top of my head, but it is in there. So for interoperability, there's crossworks, other schemas which we'll get to, but I'm trying to use common vocabularies and standards as well. So a lot of the control vocabularies are borrowed from DataCite. There's no point trying to make researchers do something different if they're already getting conditioned to do something in a particular way. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're not trying to break researchers' hearts here. We're trying to make it just so that research data is better described. And of course, for reuse, this actual, the profile doesn't, but the actual discovery service harvests whatever additional kind of descriptive or disciplinary metadata is provided. So it's worth mentioning now that this is a discipline-neutral metadata profile, and this is really important when it comes to discovery, because it's the only way to bring together all of these different data sets into one place. If you make it discipline metadata dependent, it will skew everything. It will eliminate or create a high barrier for lots of other data. That kind of procedure works on a data center level. It doesn't work at a harvesting level. It doesn't work at a kind of aggregator level, and that's why, although the rich metadata is desirable, it shouldn't be part of the core metadata profile. I hope that makes sense. I say shouldn't. I don't want to tell anyone how to do how to come up with their metadata profile, but that's a kind of in my experience, that's a big no-no to rely on that kind of metadata, because it just grinds everything else to a halt, and yeah, it creates a barrier too high for everybody else. So the cardinality we're talking about, so we have mandatory, recommended, and optional. So as you can see, we're pretty lightweight. We don't ask for too much. Those are the core things. Those are the core things. I'm sure you know why these are the core things. It's because these are the parts that form a data citation. Apart from contact, ignore contact. Contact is mandatory for a specific reason in the discovery service, because there has to be a contact to the repository that's providing the metadata. That's why. But creator title, unique resource identity, URI, and date, those are the key components of a data citation, and that's pretty much why that's the stuff that's mandatory in almost every metadata profile. So how we harvest all of this, all of these records is into our service is via these formats. We have got others now, which I'll allude to shortly. But OAI-PMH is a kind of metadata harvesting protocol. It's how we get the CCAN, and that's how we collect metadata records from the repositories and express them in CCAN. So what's going on here that's relevant to the metadata profile is we are trying to match fields from these schemas onto our core profile. This is the hard bit. This is a technically and conceptually hard thing to do. Number one, because of the variety of data and metadata we're handling here. This is why having data centers and universities is both a blessing and a curse. it means you have to do it the hard way, but the hard way is the right way in this case. It has to be a level playing field for all research data. But of course, some of these some of these data centers come with some very heavy metadata schemas. Two of which I've listed here, which is DDI 2.5 and Gemini 2.2. In my final slide, I've put a link to both of these. Not for the faint of heart, but if you fancy a look, be my guest, and you can kind of see some of the challenges that we're dealing with here, and why it's really important to, on this kind of base discovery level, to keep things simple. So as you can see from the kind of red and the green over on the right, this is kind of the crosswalks. So we've got kind of doubling core mods, DDI, ADS, which is the archaeological data service. They have a specific, as you can probably guess, there's a specific geographical schema. And I've got DataSite. I won't go into OpenAir and Serif. That's even more scary. But you know, you can see that part of my job is to make sure that this core profile that I've created is perfectly aligned with all of these others. And I get the experts at these data centers to make sure that the mappings that are given in these boxes, and you can see some of them are in XPath and long-form style, you know, there's not for the faint of heart, this is technical stuff. It has to be the right one. It's no point guessing this work, you know, I've said creator means this, they have to give me their version of that from their schema, or explain what the closest mapping is. That's the business of the, you know, the metadata mapping and the crosswalking. So some of the things we've been doing recently, what we're working on at the minute is kind of formalizing the schema development process. So this is how I produce different versions. We're on 1.1 at the minute. So this is kind of fitting into place with, you know, harvesting what, you know, people want, additions and things like that. So we've added metadata licenses and contributor recently because that's what the pilots wanted. It makes sense within the context of the pilots that we have, so we added them. The other thing we want to do is basically create richer mappings from these schemas. You know, so we don't want 5 fields, we want 15 fields, we want 18 really, but not every single harvesting format is up to this. For those who might know about OAI protocols, OAI DC is 15 fields. It is the core, doubling core. That's obviously not going to cover certain fields. It's certainly not going to cover some of the control vocabularies. So we're looking for ways of kind of getting richer metadata where it exists from the repositories and making sure that it's present in the records that we display in the discovery service. So this is looking at the OAI PMH format options. I did mention the research data shared service at the beginning, so I just want to say now that the work I've been doing with this discovery service is basically just being piped into the shared service, because it basically amounts to a starting point for people saying how much metadata is enough, how do we describe, we're going to have a shared service that everyone's going to use, what is the expectation for the metadata they've got to provide. Now we can start at the ground zero. You know, if people want to start adding metadata, we can tell them, well, you need to do at least X amount. You need to do this, that, and the other, or we won't accept it. So some of the developers that we've got working on the project are creating metadata microservices to do just this. So they have thresholds for acceptance. They have a minimum scoring where, so if you haven't completed mandatory fields, the record will be rejected. And after that, I've put in some kind of arbitrary band thresholds for bronze, silver, and gold metadata standard ratings. I don't know whether this is going to induce researchers to complete more information, but because we're starting from you know, our own kind of starting point, it gives us an opportunity to kind of give it a bit more stick and hopefully some carrot as well. So we want to encourage metadata completeness. The other thing about the metadata microservices is it makes it possible to harvest and automate, you know, metadata from elsewhere in the service and pre-populate the fields. This is something that you know, researchers really, really like. Something else I want to bring to your attention And this comes back to the point Jason made earlier on, where we're talking about kind of, are we talking about objects or data sets or something? Um, I'm really into this data model at the minute, and I'm really into it mostly because it's really simple. The other good thing about it is it's basically the starting point for the whole discussion about Hydra, the repository software in the States at the minute. States are definitely driving this, and you know, everyone else around the world is taking notice of this. The other thing I like about it is for a technical repository kind of data model, this kind of stuff's very familiar to, if you've got any library background, this is very familiar. So, you know, you can look at this and think, well, hey, I understand this straight away. So there's a relationship between two things, right? You know, like there's the collection. You know, so if this was a library, you've got a book on the right. You know, you've got a shelf underneath, and at the top you've got your stacks, or you know, you've got your whatever library. So, or from a data perspective, you've got ever increasing complexities of research objects. And this is why I want to say, you could say, Jason's point is, you know, here it's clear where you put object, and you might want to say the collection is the data set. But actually, data set, you know, you have to be careful about how you use that term. So it's particularly if you kind of do this. So if you're kind of going to look at it like this, you have these relationships all kind of figured out. And you just have to be clear about what, you know, how you're mapping your vocabulary onto this. I like collection object file. It helps a lot in the placement of metadata. And you can see this from these different colored dots here, where you can see this is the type of metadata that's associated at a particular level. Now you can see things like at a file level, yeah, there's things like licensing, but it's a kind of a technical description. You know, it might be a CC by 4 or something, whereas at an object level you might have something saying this is a mixed license, or this has varying licenses. You know, it's kind of a more human purpose description of things. You might have it even higher at a collection level. So it's a really nice model, and it's something that's informing all of my thinking about the work that I do at the minute. And what's good about that is it means my thinking is matched up with people who are working with repositories and developing repositories. If this is how they're thinking, this is how I'm thinking, we're going to be able to have a really good conversation about stuff. So just to summarize, how much is enough? Well, you know, cop-out answer, it depends. It's always going to depend. No one-size-fits-all solution to this. All the researchers are different. But maybe, you know, extrapolating and getting away from disciplinary metadata, whereas is kind of anathema to researchers, but actually in terms of bringing together records and making sense of them, being able to allow people to find them and not reuse them, find them, actually disciplinary metadata is actually not really any use. So the FAIR principles kind of lays this out, and, you know, there's not a particular order to it just because it's FAIR, but, you know, findability is the starting point. Nothing else is relevant until you found it. So don't underestimate the importance of discovery. It's very important. And you know, it might just seem like the most obvious thing in the world, but it's not. You know, you really have to kind of you have to get that right, or nothing else will kind of fall into place after it. Something from my homespun philosophy and personal experience: researchers don't like entering metadata. They really don't. You know, it's not that they don't understand it. It's not that they don't love it or kind of get what it does. They just haven't got the time. So any automation principles that can be offered up to make their life easier, and to maybe take metadata from the laboratory equipment or elsewhere from their kind of metadata footprint in their institution, that would be an enormous help. And of course, for any of this to work and to slim the amount of schemas down, to reduce the amount of profiles and ontologies and get people to talking or having the same conversation, it's important to get international buy-in on this. There has to be community consensus from everyone. You know, you'll see that some disciplines are really nailing this, like, you know, kind of bioinformatics, medicine, places like that, they have self-organized because they have had to. They get their metadata right because they have to. Otherwise, their entire research enterprise becomes an unholy mess. And therefore, they are kind of leading the way, and everyone else can follow. It would be painful, but it can be done. Well, thanks very much. That's all I wanted to say. There will be time for questions. I know there's some in the chat, so we're going to go through those. But I've mentioned a few things during the presentation. So I've made links available to some of those, just so it's all in one place for you. For the Discard EM work, do have a look at what we get up to here in the UK. Like I said, I've talked to everyone about this, from Canada to Australia. This is an issue for a lot of people who are working on these kind of services at the minute. So it's not just kind of local. Just because it's in the UK doesn't mean it's not kind of important. It will be relevant, a lot of it. So do have a look at that stuff. I spend all my time looking for things everywhere else in the world to inform my thinking. And yeah, just some other links to things that I've mentioned. So, right, okay, thanks very much for your time. That's enough of me talking. Jason, would you like to go through any of the questions that have been asked? And I'll try and do my best to answer them. And anything else that anybody does want to ask in having listened to what I've got to say.
Sure, I can do that. As you've seen the chat, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, okay. One of the questions, could you just go back to the collection, the PCDM model? Because I wanted to clarify something as we have the group together. The practice, the exercise for today is building a data dictionary, much like what Dom has done on a very larger level than we're anticipating.
Good luck, everyone.
Yeah. But I wanted to point out, I think, Dom, what we're going to focus on is the data dictionary for the object level. And maybe I'll make that more clear in the assignment itself, but does that, to your understanding in the small amount of time we have, is that a pretty good idea that we should focus there rather than collection or file for that data dictionary? Requirements for the object.
That's a good idea because that's where most of the descriptive metadata lies. For going up one level of the data model, with the collection, it doesn't matter. All you're possibly describing is a larger collection of research objects, like an experiment, something like that. You could look at it that way. And when you get down to file, you've got, you have got licensing, you have got format, and just as a word of advice, even though I put format in the discovery metadata schema, it's not in the shared service because format resides. It's a technical extrapolation that involves that exists through processes at a file level. So you don't really need. I wouldn't say you don't need to include format at an object level because it could be a mixed. It's kind of come out as a formality because of what people ask for, but actually there's a place. What this model makes explicit is there's a place for these different bits of metadata, and I think yes, it would be best to concentrate on object because that's where all the devil is as well. That's where a lot of the detail is, but also a lot of the devil. That's where the challenge is. So.
Thanks. I'll make that a little more clear in the as we describe the assignment. So Lisa is asking a question about ways to automate metadata. You have obviously
Yeah. Okay. So I can talk about it at a conceptual level rather than a technical level. So say going back to the shared service that we that I mentioned. So the shared service. Institutions have varying levels of research data management capability. Some are really advanced, some are throwing a lot of money at it, some have no infrastructure at all to deal with this, and yet everybody is funded by the same few funders. So therefore, the rules, the mandates, the requirements that are handed down to researchers are valid for all of them, no matter what access they have to infrastructure. So the whole point of the shared service, and why it's an integral part of what GIS is going to offer in the UK, is because it's going to have to offer a kind of uh, a kind of an individual up to a complete package of materials, from repository, preservation tools, kind of reporting modules, everything, because you can imagine, some people, they just want to pick this, they want to manage it, they want to have a nice little dashboard to help them work out, whether the repository is going to go into the red zone or something. But what that means, and going back to Lisa's point, what that means is we're having to find a way to integrate various kind of modules into the software that already exists in institutions. And if we nail the interoperability, it means that we can record metadata from one system and utilize it in another in an automated fashion. So one of the real wins of a shared service is to start with this whole coherent, in this whole coherent place. Where, if you think about it, in a way, if you're buying the entire service as a cloud or something, it's going to sing for you. It's going to work so well together you won't believe it. For us as in developing the service, the challenge is going to be for kind of taking this piecemeal approach to people that just want different pieces. But yeah, just to give a concrete example, rather than just kind of talk about what we'd like to do, Lisa, is I'm working on a protocol called a data deposit protocol called SWORD. SWORD's already in use and has been in use for some years now to deposit academic papers. So with a little bit of adjustment, we can make it, we can improve that, make it more specific to research data. But the SWORD protocol allows you to deposit metadata once, but in multiple places at the same time. So you only need to write once. This is, this is about rekeying or minimizing rekeying. So, the researcher only wants to do it once, but if that's got to end up in 3 different places over a period of 3 months, then it's locked into the system, and the SWORD protocol can transfer that between different systems. So that's a concrete, every day we can use it now way of doing automation and saving the researchers time, and they really do appreciate that.
Okay, Rita has a question about data reusability. Can you see it?
Yeah. Okay, reproducibility, is it a given? Reproducibility is never a given, ever. Okay, so I think a lot of disciplines that require reproducibility are struggling with this issue at the minute. There's a lot of conversation going on here about the limits of reproducibility, which I understand, that's what the researchers and the scientists want to talk about. But that isn't helpful to us. In a way, that feels like a bit of a, they're trying to get out of jail before they know they're going to get thrown in. So I think what you have to do for reproducibility is start thinking about emulation, and therefore, if you're running computer models or things like that, you have to, or laboratory stuff, and it can be emulated, i.e. a digital environment can be recreated that is, for the purposes of our discussion, identical. And this is the way that, funnily enough, this is the way a lot of preservation experts are kind of looking at how to do all of it, in fact. Because if you can do it for once, if you can make an experiment reproducible, and you can basically create a virtual machine or an emulator that will deliver that environment and allow you to run the experiments, or will make some changes, but gives you that starting point, and there's no argument that that is the starting point, and that's what they used, and you are going to reproduce results through that, or not. Remember, reproducibility is an evaluation of the accuracy of the science, or the data collected. But of course, but if you can do that, then there's a lot of options that become open to you, and in fact, you can start packaging up huge parts of kind of science and allowing people to do that. So one of the things they've heard of the LHC, the CERN in Switzerland. They've recently dropped about 360 gig of their Large Hadron Collider data from pre-Higgs discovery. So I think it's 2011. So basically, that's all built into a virtual machine, which you then go and download, and you jump in and you go looking. You know that you're essentially you're the scientist looking for clues in that data. Okay, you still need to know a little bit about particle physics. You know that's always going to be a given, but you know there is a real sense that that can be achieved. But I will add a caveat because I spoke to the guy who basically looks after all of the data for the LHC. I was lucky enough to meet him a few months ago, and I asked him how much effort it took to make that 360 gig available in the way that they made it available for everyone to use. And he said, oh, and I'll censor this, a hell of a lot. So that's all right for CERN because they're very well resourced, but you know it might not be practical for anyone else. That technology's got a long way to go. But I mean, sorry, going back to your point, Rita, is that you know one of the things we're working on, particularly for the shared service, is a preservation pipeline, which will basically mean that over a period of say 10 years, we make sure that formats are updated according to a set of format registries that we use in the UK, and a piece of technology called Pronom, and it's run by the National Archives. So that's the registry we use. It's a really important thing, and again, going back to what I was saying, that's why, in a way, kind of the real preservation eggheads are thinking seriously about emulation for everything, because it actually avoids the whole format obsolescence problem. That's another conversation.
So Kathy also asked about the crosswalking. Looks very useful. Could we get a copy? This is also related to Allegra's question regarding, she mentions that they're looking to publish some of their library journals in DC, but one indexer is requiring or asking for mods. So in your work, what were your crosswalking tools? What were the most helpful? And Allegra, feel free to jump in if I'm not kind of getting at the gist of your question.
Right, okay, so number one useful tool with my head, to say that, I did a lot of research myself. I was quite happy to do that, you know. I couldn't rely on expertise for all of the format mappings. You know, obviously I don't pretend to be an expert on DDI or Gemini. I have domain experts to help me with those. But mods reasonably well understood. Some of the what I did was talk through the people that actually kind of shared mods over OII PMH and looked at why they shared it, and you know typically it was kind of a legacy issue out of library systems, things like that. And but otherwise I just went through their schema and figured it out. I mean, I haven't come up with anything radical in the core profile. And a lot of the additions that are kind of technical, like the persistent identifiers, they're not really in mods. I don't think. However, you know, that's not to say that you know, I just looked, and just because I didn't find it doesn't mean it's not there. So I didn't actually use any tools for Allegra apart from, you know, just hard, just hard, painstaking work. However, I would imagine there are tools though. If you have a look around, if you do some kind of research and bit of googling, and you'll find that there's a lot of GitHub stuff out there. And there's a lot of stuff in GitHub out there, which is mappings that people have obviously done for individual projects. So you might well find what you're looking for, because the chances are someone has already tried to do it. I can't guarantee it's there, but also if you're mapping from DC, the mods conversion is not too difficult, if you get what I mean. Because you're talking about like DCMI, if you're working with a lot of fields, it might be more complicated, but the relationship between the two schemas are quite well understood, I'd like to think that you would be able to find that mapping, on a technical XML level, although I don't have a link to hand. Oh dear. If you've got to ask Elsevier anything, it's kind of good luck. They want their own language. Just be like they're sealing off their own version of the research data management at the minute. So, I hope they will. But I don't get disheartened by it. I mean, it might be it might seem like quite a technical headache, but once you get looking into it, I don't think it'll be too difficult. But what I will do is I'm on a train tomorrow morning going to a meeting. I'll have a look for you. And in answer to your previous part of the question, I am in the process of stripping off all these crosswalks because the document I've been using recently has become unusable because we're just adding so many. I'll be able to supply, I'll give Jason a viewing link for that, if that's okay with everyone. Give me a few days though, because it's a bit ragged at the minute.
Tom, I think we're kind of coming to the end of this section,
yeah, sure.
but I wanted to check on, I just posted it in the
it was
chat.
Anne's.
Was it UCAT that required?
UDAT.
Okay, they need.
UDAT's the least. They require one field, which is a title. So.
Oh, one. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
UDAT requires one, which is title, and the Australian National Data Service require 26. But the reason is because they have quite a complicated kind of relationship between. They have a complicated way of dealing with all the metadata for objects because of they're having to do it from a kind of a top to bottom and bottom to, they've got to cover everything in their schema. So I should put a link to. I'll try and get you a link to it. So I'll type in what it says. So this is the metadata profile they use. And let me just go and have a look. Whilst you're talking, I'll go and see if I can track down a link to it.
That sounds great. We'll leave the chat open as we're talking. And Dom has graciously agreed to stick around as we talk through the data dictionary exercise because he's obviously very interested, but also might provide some insight into how we can approach the exercise itself. I see the link, Dom. Thank you.
No problem.
And thank you again for your time.
You're very welcome. It was always a pleasure to talk
feel free.
about.
Feel free to, as we're speaking in this next section, feel free to jump in the chat or just unmute if you want to speak again. Perfect. So I think for this first part, Sarah was going to just look a little bit at the assignments, just to catch us up on where we were with the project, the Digital Humanities project assignments. She had earmarked a few that she wanted to mention in particular.
Yeah, the assignments were so fun to look at this week. Thanks, you guys, for sharing them. I guess I wanted to sort of just give a few overlaps that I saw. I saw that both NIH and Berkeley had done projects with data visualization. Berkeley, in fact, talked about visualizing their own data services. So a digital scholarship project that is going to help them understand themselves. I thought that was pretty cool. And then I also enjoyed reading from McAllister and University of Iowa. They had both scoped out projects about immigration and the history of their own state. So that was really interesting. And then Middlebury had a project that was mapping public art on Middlebury campus, which reminded me of a new app that's come out in Montana. It's called Explore Big, explorebig.com, or .org rather. And then you could also look at, I had a meeting with the lady who developed it the other day, and she gave me a link to the data that informed the app. So I'm going to drop some links into the chat in case you guys are interested. Oops. That first link is wrong. So yeah, and then I also wanted to ask about the peer review process. It seems like there was some confusion last week about it, and I wanted to make sure that everyone is still enjoying that and understanding how to do it, how the logistics work.
So you can probably hear me typing. It's Jason.
So I guess no response means everyone is doing fine. Is that right? Oh yeah, Jason, go ahead and you can unmute and put in your Jason. Yeah, the Gantt chart is very cool.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that kind of Albany went in above and beyond. And if you do want to see what a Gantt chart looks like, this, not that you can't look it up, but this is just another working example of a really nice, the project itself, and then the actual kind of timeline, workload, and tasks associated with that project itself. It also looks like, I remember Lisa had a problem with not in particular Lisa's fault, but some people were having problems getting into the shared folders. It looks like I opened up all the settings and you should be able to submit into that Google Drive. But we were kind of, as Sarah suggested, we were hoping that silence meant things were okay, because you know you're always free to reach out to us. The one last thing I'll say about the projects, just in terms of inspiration, take a look at the various topics that they move from, visualization of local projects to really advanced digital humanities work, and that was really interesting to see as well. So thank you all for sharing and putting that forward. Well, we do have Dom on the line, so I do want to maybe make a quick switch to mention just kind of walk through and pick up the ideas of the exercise for this week or for this month. Much like what you saw Jisk and Dom and Dom's research as he was putting together a core metadata profile, Sarah and I thought this session or this assignment exercise focusing on what we see as minimum viable metadata for an object in a data repository. Rita, am I allowed to share my screen? Can you, I think Dom is currently, I just want to bring up the assignment so I can show it to the group. Thank you. This is a new machine. I'm going to have to pitch that because it wants to download something. Sorry, I just got a new machine this week and it doesn't have the right Flash player. I'm going to pass the URL in so you guys can follow along. Just so you see it. Give me a second. So that is where the assignment is. Sarah did a nice rewrite where she actually helped define the data dictionary itself, so in case we're kind of wondering what that is. This is something that metadata authors, catalogers put together as they're visualizing or envisioning the metadata profile itself. The main kind of takeaway from this is just to think through, as we talked about, where if you had a set of metadata that you had to require, and you think, obviously you can look at Dom's work, but also just taking your local context into account. Where are your researchers in knowing what metadata is? How much could you expect from them? That sort of thing. All of those considerations play a part into how to put this together. And we obviously pointed to the FAIR data principles, which Dom spoke about. We also mentioned the W3C data on the web best practices that can help you get as a guide. And we provided an example of a working example of a data dictionary that you can use. So much like the project template blueprint we gave you, you have something to start from. So were there any questions related to that exercise? Feel free to just let us know. Obviously, if you don't have a question right now, you can reach out to us at any time. Does it seem fairly straightforward?
And our example is a little different from Dom's, so I think Dom's it is a good example to look to as well. That one's really elaborate, and the one that we put in was something that Jason and I had put together for our data repository. So you can take a look at both and decide which example fits your needs better.
I thought Allegra was typing, but I'm not sure if she is. So yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I just say something, Jason?
Of course.
I'm sure they know this, but you know, I just wanted to kind of say that this kind of exercise. I did try and stress this at the time, but you know, this isn't just an academic exercise that you're doing here. You know, I have to do things like this. I've got to do lots of it soon, and you know, so I don't. I'm sure you don't think that, but you know, this is the real. This is the nuts and bolts of this kind of work, you know. So, you know, this kind of documentation and doing this in a consistent way is just very, very important. You know, this is how else everybody else understands, you know, what to do. And of course, interoperability in humans and machines is dependent on this. So, yeah, I just want to say that I am finding it useful just to look at it, and I shall have this at my desk over the next few weeks while I do similar work to this. That's all I wanted to say, Jason.
That's great. Thank you. And I could also potentially, if you wanted to, I'm willing to, if the group is, we could, as we finish up, if you wanted to see some of the samples, we could potentially share them with you, just to give you a little more perspective on the outcome of the exercise. But let us know, and I'll check with the group if they're
That'd be
comfortable
great.
with
No,
that.
that'd be fantastic. I'd love to see that.
I had a thought. Oh, so we have we postponed, and we were able to get Dom to be available for this one because he's coming back from holiday. We have a speaker for September. It is Bonnie Tijerina. She's a research data fellow who's going to speak to us about the ethics of data and data sharing, data privacy and data ethics. And she is a Data and Society Fellow at the Data and Society Research Institute, which is a think tank in New York. So we're looking forward to that. That is September 21st, I believe. So Sarah and I will pass along more details as we know a little more. We're also going to reach out to you email just to clarify a couple of things and get some opinions. So we'll do that in the next couple of days. Were there any other questions as we were leaving the topic of data discovery and or the assignments? I see Allegra's question right here. No, Allegra, that would be fine. I mean, I think in the assignment we said institutional repository data, but if you have other collections that you've created data dictionaries for or want to revise or audit, that would be perfect as well. We were kind of assuming that most of us had IRs, but we tried to make room for other types of collections. I think the important work is building a profile of understanding the requirements and where the sweet spot is between required metadata and nice to have metadata, that kind of thing. And Bethany just tweeted a link or pushed a link into the for Bonnie. It's going to be a really fun session next month as well. Okay. Sarah created a Slack channel for the assignments. So if you're starting to work and you want to talk more in a forum setting and just catch up with people about clarifications or just bounce ideas, please use that as well. I linked to it in the assignment directions. And Sarah and I will be watching the channel as well.
Yeah, and also Ryan from Reed had started a channel for further reading, sort of to share resources, so check out that channel too. Or sorry, Ryan from Middlebury, sorry. He used to be at Reed.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. Okay, then if we're settled for today, I think we will, Rita, we can stop recording, and then I will put the slides and the recording up as soon as it's available, and I'll email the group. Thank you all.